These two artists represent a wonderful collaboration whose creations resonate with each other. Here at the gallery, we enjoy placing works side by side so that we can see how they complement each other, if there's any kind of dialogue. With Andrew and Amanda, we notice how they share a focus on common, everyday materials, such as old fabrics, discarded suits that are made beautiful with those flowers, discarded books, because Amanda's very worried that the written word is going to disappear, and dismantling books and making art with Andrew is sewing on another type of repurposed material. They make equally fascinating art. In addition to the similarities, there are subtle differences, some of which they don't hence share, hence the upcoming dialogue. And I want them to explain the differences and the commonality of their work. Amanda and Andrew.
So I just wanted to say thank you all for coming. It's nice to see you. I want to say a special thanks to Zubel Books. I'm assuming this is being recorded, so I want to say thank you to them. They have provided books to me for the last 20 years. So it's been a wonderful relationship. I'd like to thank the GCAC for the individual artist grant that made the piece in the middle possible. And I would like to thank Hammond Harkins for the opportunity to show this work. Thank you so much, Laura and Marlena, Nikki. And thank you to Andrew for speaking today. So I'm not a super fan of these kind of talks, so I'm going to be very brief. So if there's one thing that I would like for everybody to take away from this moment is that words have power. And a question that I would pose to you is what happens when we remove the words? I have 3 little parts in my talk right now, and the first is a confession, the second is process, and the third is history. So some of you know, but not everybody knows that I have not shared my past loudly. I began as a designer. My passion was typography. At the age of 19, I would go to bed with stacks of type specimen books in my bed and going through serif and sans serif and display fonts, typefaces. Back then, you couldn't do that on a laptop because it didn't exist and there was not a smartphone. That led me to carving typefaces out of metal, molding them later into lead to print with. I continued to seek out historical typefaces and specimen at the Newberry Library with one of my favorites, a multi-volume series of Bedoni bound and red leather, handmade paper, letterpress printed. Words are never as sexy as they are when they're in letterpress printed and big and on handmade paper. So it's pretty exciting. So that's my passion place. That's my history. My MFA was in interdisciplinary arts, but the primary focus was on the book, fine binding, letterpress printing, and paper making. I apprenticed with Jan Sobota, a master binder outside of Prague and Lakhet, Czech Republic. One of the books that you guys might know that came through the studio was a Gutenberg Bible, and it was dismantled in the shop. And while I was there, I got to see it fully dismantled and did some paper restoration on that. It was inspiring to see it in its deconstructed state. I continued to do conservation work in graduate school and then opened my own studio in 2002, Love Leaf Press, which was a fine binding letterpress studio that I had until 2011. We did a lot of private commissions for museums, artists, foundations, photographers, musicians, celebrities. I had an amazing crew of mostly all students from the Art Institute and Columbia College. It was a wonderful time, and we made great things. It was a lot of fun. So second is process. Like a printmaker or a photographer, I enjoy process. I like to think about the making of the book process, the pieces, the parts, the cutting, the folding, the sewing, the measuring many, many times, again and again. I continue to challenge myself by creating systems for making, and then I leave things up to intuition as they come together. A lot of people have asked me, I can't see it in this group, in these faces, but a lot of people do ask me, why am I destroying books? And funny, I don't see it as destroying books at all. I see it as connecting with a form that I've had a long and intimate history with and a deep respect for the book. I see the beauty and the deconstruction of its form when it's wide open and vulnerable. My life has been books, typography, materials that make books, thread, paper, ink. I read a lot of books. I collect books. The center of my home is a library. I'm a book person through and through. I've studied the book as its form, trying to push the boundaries when I had Loveleaf, using different materials and trying different things. I've studied the history of reading, book theory, asked questions that we all ask as print dead. I'm now studying the loss of knowledge and the act of groups of people trying to take away words, to eradicate cultures, dismantle a sense of democracy, taking away the words. And last but not least is the work in this exhibit. So I dismantle books to understand them. I've dismantled just about under 10,000 books to date. Whether it's the act of ripping or burning, I'm trying to get into the head of someone that would do such a thing. Again, there's a curious beauty that remains in the dismantled book parts. It's very physical to remove the covers. It has a distinct smell and sound when you rip the covers off the text block. Once the covers are removed, each book has a story to tell about when it was made via the glue, the spine, the crash, the paper, whether it was calendared with clay or left alone. And to me, it's I know this is going to sound really weird, it's very meditative to rip continuously over and over again a certain movement. I put them back together, I rearranged them. This work, No Words, began on January 10th this year. I was at artist residency at VCCA in Virginia, and I made a photo piece after I had burned a series of book down to ash and documented it. And the piece was called Last Night's Board of Education Meeting in McMinn County, Tennessee. The book that was on the chopping block, I'm sure you all know, was Mouse by Art Spiegelman, a graphic novel. I feel a deep sense of loss, and I'm concerned. I'm really concerned about what happens when you remove all the words. Each of these pieces on the wall are a single book, so when you're standing in front of them, you're looking at one entire book. So I brought, just so you could see, I don't know how many of you get to see fully dismantled. So this is a book after I've ripped the covers off. What you see are the folds, those are signatures, and that is the sewing that has been left. So in some of the pieces you see the sewing. And this is a small, sweet little chapbook. this is a little book, and so these signatures are what I take apart. And in this body of work, I'm ripping down to the margins where the words are being fully removed. Okay. So the color you see is the ink of the words that was once printed on the page. Some are color of memory of those printed words, and the words are gone, but the ink remains as a memory of the content that was removed. So specifically, some of the books had blue ink or black ink or maybe a dirty brown ink. That was what was influencing the color that I was choosing for the ink. In the case of like the clay or the pink, it's more or the yellow. It's more the feeling that I had with the book itself, or a memory that I've had with a certain book. And then, last but not least, the mirror. We all have a history with a book. We have a connection to words. Books can be time capsules. Books can be performance art, turning a page and reading aloud. To look at these books and, what do you feel? What do they remind you of? And what part of the book do you identify with? Is it the paper? Is it the color? Or is it the content? And now imagine if all the words were taken away.
I second Amanda's thank you for being here. My hope is that I'll speak briefly, and then I was telling Amanda, sometimes talks are more interesting when you're sort of in dialogue with either one another or with folks here. So I'll give you, here's a brief story. My work's on this back half. So here's a brief story that may kind of gesture at some of what I'm up to here. When I was a kid, I grew up in Cincinnati, and every summer, I grew up in a church-going home. So every summer, my family would drive out every day for a week to Indiana, to a field in rural Indiana, and they would have what they call a camp meeting. So a big tent would be erected in a field. I mean, think of the big tent spikes in the field. No parking lot. People were just parking on the grass, and women with their heels sinking into the mud every night for a week. There would be a traveling preacher that would come and preach for the week. There was an old upright piano someone had rolled out there to the field. And, it's an interesting thing to think of what was it that we were looking for or needing to do that. There are lots of areas in life where a desperation can be a bad thing, but there's also parts of life where a desperation can be a really good thing, can be a really generative and driving thing. And it's an interesting thing in my child's mind to remember those summer camp meetings and the way that we were allowed a space to be desperate together, sort of alone together, but desperate together. At the end of those services, or toward the latter part of those services, every night they would have they would kind of ask for what they call these prayer requests. So anyone out in the audience have something they want the community to pray for? Someone would stand up, and someone might say, oh, my uncle has an illness, or I've lost my job, or, so they were, whether one imagines themselves to be religious or not, imagine asking the community to bear witness to something that you're experiencing or that you're going through, which is what was happening. But occasionally someone would stand up and they would say, Pastor, it's unspoken. And then they would sit back down. And when the pastor then prayed for all the prayer requests, he would say, be with Tom's back and Mary's surgery and the sister's unspoken or the brother's unspoken request. And it was an amazing thing as a child to hear adults say that some things didn't have words, or maybe they did have words, but you just hadn't quite found what the right word was. And as an example, the suit behind you against the window with the white paint and the ropes, the braided ropes kind of falling to the floor. You could say, what was that experience? It was a church experience, and someone gets up and they have an aching back and they ask for a prayer request and they sit down and that's all there is. But But that's never all that there is, right? Life's far more complicated than that. And in my kind of working through as an adult, what might that have been? How can I try to identify or articulate what was happening in that moment? It seemed like when people stood up and said, "Pastor, it's unspoken," it both kind of nailed them to the ground. It sort of activated that something. And I could also get this sense that something was released, something was sort of let go or dislodged in them. The falling of the yarn, for instance, the braiding, the kind of labored, gnarly braiding, but then the way it falls, but then the way it has a weight when it hits the ground, felt somehow akin to that experience for me, or at least to my child's mind. Largely for me, I pursue an art that's more of an inquiry than a statement. I used to teach and I used to tell my students that good art shouldn't look like a mouth asserting, it should look like a mind thinking. And in that way, I don't start a priori, I don't start with something known and then kind of illustrate what I know with color or fabric or whatever. There's much more of a sense of the art's illuminating something that's hidden or illuminating something that can be disclosed through form. The French philosopher Lyotard says that one of the tasks of art is to make visible or to make evident that some things are invisible. It's a huge 20th century philosophical debate. Do we just know things through empiricism, through the five senses? And if that's so, how do we account for things like morals, ethics? What metric might we use to sort of prove, if you will, that morals are a sort of structure of the world? Other philosophers, the continental philosopher says, no, it's not quite like that. There's a lot more going on in our knowledge than we can access through the five senses. We have metaphysics, for instance, they would say. So in all of these works, I am largely driven by a kind of generative desperation. The works usually begin with a kind of agitation or a kind of question, and then I'm trying to work my way toward clarity. There are moments when our hands can be more articulate than our mouths can be. Our making can be more articulate than something that we've said. I'm a writer as well, so I love words, but I also am cognizant of their limitations. And I think a lot of these works, I'm trying to gesture at other ways of knowing that are outside of sort of linguistic knowing. There are those moments, I'm sure you've all experienced them in many ways. I saw a guy getting out of the car. I went to go get coffee down High Street, and I saw a guy open his door, and he stepped out and got out of his car, and kind of the way he held his head, it was like a flash. It was something crushing about it. I mean, I can't account for what that was. Maybe there was nothing there, but there are those moments, something is activated. And moments like that seem to lodge themselves into my thinking, and they embed, and then I'm thinking, how do I think about what that is through form, through the making, through a kind of time-made visual, through kind of extended labor in that way. Which is one of the reasons that we wanted to call the show "Everything Contains Some Silence." That's a line. It's the first line of a poem from the poet Kay Ryan, U.S. Poet Laureate. The poem is called "Shark's Teeth," but the first line is "Everything contains some silence." And it seemed to really fit what Amanda and I are doing similar and different things. And in both our practices, there's a recognition that the reality of the world will exceed my ability to totalize it in language. So that's a bit of at least what I'm up to. I think we have a dialogue, and we have a dialogue back and forth, and see what interesting things might emerge. Is there anything we can speak to initially? Practical things of work or conceptual things of... Sure. So this kind of grid shape, there were some drawings initially, and at the bottom of these kind of grid drawings, I wrote "How I Became Human." Partly because, how do I become human? Well, I was conceived, and then I was born, and I grew up, and I'm left-handed, and there's that kind of aspect to how I became myself today. And yet that barely even gestures at the reality of how I became human. So there was something about using the grid which was almost kind of a faux grid because it's all wonky and it doesn't really, it's hardly a structural grid. But it was me thinking about both, there is that structure on life, right? There is that gridded structure. I belong to a certain family at a certain time, and I live in a certain town at a certain era in the world. And yet, that's only a small part of that narrative. So there's also this kind of corrective. I like the way that the grid almost reads like paragraphs. You sort of go left to right, the next line left to right. And with it, with this sort of marking over top of the, one mark over top of another, there's a kind of like finding the right mark, right? It's sort of an in-time or real-time editing that those drawings have. And I'm, as a writer, I'm often, I get kind of caught by phrases or passages, and then incorporate those frequently into the works. So again, I think succinctly, it's the reference to the grid, but it's also undermining the grid, and then it's that very hand. I should say generally, I love works in which you can see the mark of the hand. I don't want to hide anything from you. If I was putting on plays, I would want you to see all the behind-the-scenes stuff. I'd want you to see all the chords. I kind of like that non-illusionistic, because of the human touch that's kind of evident in those. Yeah.
So September, I don't know if many people know this, is there's a second to last week in September is book banning week. It's a week that people get together and raise awareness internationally. Pen America out of New York hosts an entire week of awareness and amazing speakers. And this past September, recently, there was a speaker who was talking about the history of banning books and Comstock. The phrase "to Comstock" is from like the late 1800s. It was the first time that there was the suppression of knowledge, and that was speaking specifically to something that, as a religious, highly religious person, they believed it to be pornographic, which I don't know if I believe that the pieces were, but to Comstock something is basically a way of that term has been coined in book suppression and McCarthyism. It happened again in the 80s, and it's happening again right now. The New York Times just had an article in the paper that this is the largest amount of, so there was like 1,651 titles. It's the rise of censorship efforts this year. So yeah, it's pretty, the hit on democracy is real, and they're coming after books as well. It's not the first time. That piece specifically right now is it's on show at Pomona College in California for art and type, and it'll be in Chicago November 3rd is when that opens. Thanks very much. The January 10th, the school board meeting with the mouse thing and removing, and I mean I've been knowing about book bannings. It hasn't been something that's informed my work, but starting to learn about why those things happen and trying to understand it, kind of like you were saying, it's like you have a question and you keep creating the work to help yourself answer, like what's going on, why is this happening? So I started being tipped off to different books about the history of knowledge and actually the attacks on knowledge. Alexandria, one of the greatest centers of libraries in the world was in Timbuktu per capita, and it was recently fully dismantled, and all those books and treasures are gone. I think about maybe 500,000 survived, and they were buried in people's yards and then later put out on boats to get out of the Sahara. So it's not anything new. And the reason people go after books and words is it's a power play. If you can take away the culture, if you can take away the way to share ideas, then it doesn't happen. It also can totally erase the culture. Jamaica specifically, the Cambridge Book Trust has a historian who's focused on the Rastafarian culture. They have no relics. They have no books. They have none of those things exist except for song. And so they've been completely dismantled of all of their prior books and things. So I'm just learning about all these different cultures and places, and Baghdad and their burning of all of their libraries. And to me, the piece that Marcia was asking about with word matter did have all the words, and you could read it and get bits and pieces, and I enjoyed that. But this definitely is about what happens when you do remove all the words. Like, what are we left with? And I don't know if anybody feels this way, but sometimes I don't know what to say, like with all that's going on. I feel helpless, I feel vulnerable, and I want to make a difference, but it's hard. I mean, I almost have no words for all that is going on. But I do, it felt really right to remove the words for what's happening right now, just going with my gut. And that the pieces in the center, to me, I just want to be small, and I want to walk through that forest of books that are standing on the reflective surface. I just want to be about this big, or I want those pieces to be gigantic. So yeah, I really like, they become their own things. They're not really books anymore. They go back to trees. They go back to other natural things. And it's like, what if you were to walk in that world of no words? It would be barren. It would be lonely. I was telling a couple of you, somebody sent me a picture this morning of up in Knox County, there's a reservoir, a river, lake, there was a forest, and now it's a ghost forest. And what she was kayaking through was very calm, reflective surface with all these trees sticking up. And it was pretty powerful. I mean, the image that she said, I was like, wow, I didn't know. But yeah, I mean, what would it be if we didn't have any of those words? Or if all of our words were taken away? I mean, the list of, and the reason why, it's the LGBTQ, it's race, it's racism, it's sexual content. I mean, Toni Morrison, we all know, right? One of the books that was on the list this year, The Kite Runner, The Hate You Give, All Boys Aren't Blue. To Kill a Mockingbird was on the list this year to be taken. I mean, what is going on if that book can't be read anymore? I mean, that's one of my family's favorite books. I just can't, I don't know. Okay. So Marcia's asking about Tree Time. It's a series of, come on in. It's a series of images that I've been taking from the same position for about 3 years. It's of a collection of trees, the metasequoia, and they are an endangered species of trees that there is one of the largest genetic samplings outside of China happens to be in Licking County. And so I've recently just installed a huge public art piece in 11 different locations in Licking County to talk about community over isolation, positive Sino-American relationships, and climate change. And I was recently just asked to partner with the kind of headlining scientist for the trees. He was awarded the Harvard Radcliffe Fellowship for this year, and his work is on climate change in relation to these trees. And that fellowship is an interdisciplinary relationship. And so his work on science, and I will be translating in art form. So he's asked me to be his partner in that exploration of how to share climate change through those trees.
On your website, do you have locations for?
For all those sites, I do. Yeah, thanks for asking. And it will be in Columbus in the spring. I just didn't mention that. At Grange Audubon. It'll be in Scioto Park. There will be about 30 large fabric silos that are made out of recycled sails. I do tend to work in recycled materials, I'm realizing. And I do work in in series, as the tree photographs are. But it'll be a walking installation that you'll be able to walk through and step inside. They're about 12 feet tall and 3 feet diameter.
I think for any of us, religious upbringings or not, the question of how we should be in the world and what frameworks do we use to try to answer that question. I think one of the gifts of that upbringing for me was that, it sort of disavowed a kind of ambivalence. It wasn't enough as a kid to just, sit in your mom's basement and play video games, right? There was a way that there was a certain kind of questions were pressed. How should we be in the world, and how am I going to know the answer to that question? I think, studying philosophy in grad school and in theology in grad school, I think that the questions I ask now are similar to the questions I asked then. How should we be in the world? How would I know the answer to that question? What is? Again, back to either the man getting out of his car with the kind of head turn, or pastor, it's unspoken. What is the real in that, and how do we identify what the real is in that? Even for ourselves, right? There's a way that we are. If you're anything like me, you're sort of pressed by big questions that seem to resist a kind of resolution. But we walk toward them anyway. We keep kind of pressing back into them. So I think, I just think that there's a way that I was kind of nursed on a kind of non-ambivalence about the world. It is. So my grandmothers and great-grandmothers were all, they made quilts, and they patched the knees of our grandpa's work jeans, and made quilts for all the new babies in the family. So I just grew up with a lot of hand stitching, being a part of life. I've often felt like I kind of live in two worlds. One world is sort of a history as a laborer, and the other world is academia and galleries. And I don't want to lose either of those. I want to maintain a foot in both of those worlds going forward. So I often make art like a laborer and try to labor artfully in some manner. So I like the idea of, I think partly for this particular painting, there's this question of what if efforts could be made visible, right? You try something, it either works or it doesn't work, but you want to say, but what I meant to say was X, or what I meant to do was this. It was just sort of a thought experiment. What if some of that could be rendered visibly? What would that look like? A kind of like, here's what I meant, and I'm gonna demonstrate a kind of earnestness by this really slow hand stitching. I'm gonna make a painting that takes 9 months to make, Yeah, and in that way, it's where time is made visible. We don't, the scuffs on your shoes or the patina on, steel outside, but there are other ways to make time kind of rendered visibly. And slow, inefficient labor has felt like one of those modes to me. And I think there's an interesting, it sort of operates, again, like some of these grids. It kind of has that gridded sense, but the mark of the hand is all through it. And then kind of giving that form a base felt important. It kind of has something to play off of. And that painting is called The World to Come. And I think of it being a really hopeful, both of them, but the white one particularly being a hopeful painting, that we can work to make the world we want to see. So the world to come ought not be one we dread. We can work toward making that better. And that kind of labor is one example of an earnestness toward that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Hey, Marco. I really think it gets back to your conversation with the book. The mirror has been added. The reflective surface came first. Ellen had asked earlier, where did the reflective surface come from? Originally, these pieces were constructed on a wooden board and had really extreme lightscapes happening. These do have extreme lightscapes happening. They're on a timer. The timer is turned off right now because if they were all three going at the same time, they do not sync right now. I would love for an electrician to help me with that. But what happens is it fades down to nothing and comes on bright. And the lightscapes that happen are really magical. And I'm sorry I can't show you that today, but this is the best I could do for this moment. But so they were on wood, and the light was really important, and I did see it immediately. I had just gotten back from Virginia. I was at the space in Newark at the bank, the community art space that some of you guys know about, and I had just was running out the door to go do something, and I left something, and I came back, and I had set them up on wood. But when you make something, you see it, and you don't really think about it, and you walk out the door. And I came back in, and I was like, "Holy crap! That's something I could walk through." And I got really excited to see it on this huge piece of wood. And I did imagine, maybe like a kid, is it a city? Is it a forest? What if I could make these things huge? What would it feel like? And I've played with foam core, in the 3-5-foot sphere, to break these down that way, but I would love to get to that next level to make them large. It would be amazing. I'm working with a fabricator for the show in Chicago, and he's taken my pieces to be 3 foot that are these teeny tinies. So that's kind of neat to see it grow and scale. But the reflective is definitely about your conversation. Are you the editor? Are you the one removing the words? Who is that person? Online there's truth and non-truth, and who is the person taking all those words away or adding words that really should not be? So that's what the mirror is about. It's more about reflecting back to you or what's out there. That's my question. But yeah, the reflective quality is really seductive to me, and I think it's appropriate with the questions that are being asked and what's going on right now today. I don't know if that answers.
I lived in Lexington as a kid and lots of Kentucky family. But I've lived all over East Coast, West Coast, and yeah.
In North Carolina now.
Currently in North Carolina.
You just have a very calm demeanor.
Our Southerners calm. All right, I'll take it.
Drippy.
How much time do you have? Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think there's I don't, Amanda's making, her work is more topical than mine, right? It's about words, it's about books, it's about book banning. I've never really worked in a topical way, and I've often worked, the art is the inquiry itself, in terms of there's something about form that kind of elucidates something that other modes don't. So, I mean, honestly, with all of these, with every painting in here, probably every painting I've done, or crayon thing as a kid, it's been sort of driven by this. It's driven by a question. This suit, for instance, it's this question. It's what in us needs to, what do we starve in our lives, and what do we feed? What needs to die in our lives so that something else can emerge? How do we reshape our habits and our way of being in the world to let something else kind of grow in its place? So that question would be an agitation for me. It would be something that I don't know, but I can gain little, even if by hint and trace, I can gain some clarity through the working toward it, where the hands become articulate in a way that the mouth isn't always. So I generally feel, and I pursued the arts really out of desperation. I remember specifically thinking, will I work in nonprofit work? Will I be a farmer? What is it that I will do? What's a good use of time? Not everything is a good use of time. And this working in the arts, in writing and in form, seemed like it could sort of move the needle a bit. Thinking again of the arts as inquiry rather than art as statement that's already known. I'm illustrating it or something. I think they're all potentially really good. I think they have their place. Contemporary life, there's a lot of ways to distract oneself. I mean, probably in any era. We just have them like in our pockets or our TVs or whatever. I kind of want to avail myself of desperation. Like I want to let myself be driven by a kind of generative need. Us going out to the camp meeting together as kids. What did we need out there? How do I recognize what we needed? How do I think of that in a really beautiful way that we could share need together and speak it, or Pastor, it's unspoken, not quite speak it. I sometimes, when I was teaching, I taught art for a few years, and I used to tell my students, like access some desperation, like live and work like you mean it. I used to joke with them, it probably wasn't a joke, but when they became art majors, I would say, if anyone is an art major to smoke cigarettes and wear a beret, I will fail you on day one. I just out of the gate. That's not what we're doing here. This should be driven by a different kind of need. To make the work matter, to make the work even attempt to matter, I think it needs to access a different kind of question. So, cheers to desperation. But one that doesn't get passive and immobile. A desperation that acts, and a desperation that leans in toward hopefulness. I think any artist is ultimately a hopeful character in the world. If you're just actually despairing, you just don't do anything, right? To lament is a hopeful gesture because you're saying something is not right. The world isn't quite how it should be, and I'm lamenting that reality. And so to push back on that, to make something, to offer an alternative way of being is an incredibly hopeful gesture, even if the work is ostensibly, I don't know, angry or sort of dreadful or something.
So really interesting in the Pen America, one of the comments that she's a Nigerian writer, and she was being interviewed about writing in America. And her phrase was called the cult of comfort, that the comfort writers of the United States, the comfort culture of our material has to end with a note of hopefulness. And I'm not a dark person, but And I do reserve hope for things. But I thought it was a really interesting way to think about what our culture of writing is, and does it always have to end on a hopeful note? Like, maybe it's not, and that's okay. We just have to talk about it and get to a place that we're all okay with.
There's this adage that sounds like an art school thing to say, except I think it's real, which is, I don't know what I think until I read what I wrote, or I don't know what I think until I see what I made. There are lots of, I mean, you know, I have a lot of works that are failures. They just happen not, I just hide them away. They're not in the gallery. But the ones that I think work, they do disclose something. You know, the piece, again, back here, the suit, I was thinking a long time, kind of reflecting on that, on those childhood camp meetings, kind of in concert with a poem by Kay Ryan called A Certain Kind of Eden. And when I made the piece, I sort of made the piece intuitively, and it just felt like this is how this needs to be, and this is how this needs to be. And it was actually a final project for a grad school critique. And it was like a year later that I said, oh, unspoken requests, that's what that is. There was something that my hands knew something that it like took a while for it to get up to my more conscious mind. Yeah, I also had a professor in school who said you never finish a painting, you just move on to the next one. In some ways, I mean that's both true and not true. But yeah, there's a way that if I got to a place where I wasn't learning something from my own work or from work in general, I would just like stop making art and I would just do something else. I mean, you know, I'm in it for the disclosure, not because painting is fun or something. And I'll happily put it away if something else emerges that can be more kind of clarifying. But for now, form is that clarifying force.